Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, ko Karl-Hinga, tako noa, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to this meeting, this webinar tonight. My name is Karl-Hinga. I'm a geriatrician and stroke physician based in Christchurch at Burwood Hospital, and I'm lucky enough to chair this South Island stroke webinar this evening. And behind the scenes, we have people from the South Island Alliance, particularly Andrea and Jane Large from Nelson, and also the Stroke Foundation. And so I'm just the front person, but there is a team and behind us that are doing this. Jane's going to help me collate some of the questions for this session, so we can have the questions at the end of Dan's presentation. As many of you will know, the South Island Alliance and the Stroke Working Group has run the annual Education Day. And last year we had to cancel at the last moment, but we had a whole lot of speakers lined up, of which Dan was one of them. And rather than waste all that wonderful talent, we've moved and been adaptable from an all-day, one-day session to intermittent webinars. And so whilst we can't meet in person, I think there are some benefits from having the webinars in terms of we've got perhaps a greater reach, not just the South Island, but across New Zealand. So that's one of the pluses, but we do lose some of that collegiality. This webinar is the second one we've run, and we hope to run another, at least perhaps a couple later on in the year, so watch this space. Hopefully in another couple of months, we'll run another webinar around about this time of the day. Like many of us, we feel slightly uncomfortable running webinars and being in the virtual world, and we do welcome feedback, and we try to respond to some of that feedback. So there will be a brief survey at the end of this presentation as well, either at the end of the Zoom or as an email link afterwards. And we want to know what works for you, what's useful, what doesn't work, because there's no point doing things if it doesn't work for you. Some housekeeping: you'll be on mute during the presentation. We are recording it, and we hope to put that posted on the National Stroke Network website. I'll need to negotiate with National Stroke Network, but that's all right. We'll do that. Questions may be asked at any time through the Q&A session, the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A rather than the chat, because we won't be monitoring the chat function. So it's really just the Q&A. And then we'll put all the questions to Dan at the conclusion of his talk. And any questions we don't get to answer, we will put to Dan. He can perhaps try to answer some of them, at least by email later. We've got, at the moment, we've got 61 online, which is great. There's hopefully some more will join, because I think we had up to 120 or 130 register. So it's exciting that we've got quite a large group joining us tonight. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Harvey. Dan is a senior physio at the senior physiotherapist in stroke rehab based in Dunedin Hospital for the Southern DHB. His fascination for stroke and neurological rehab was first kindled in Waikato at the acute stroke area there. And then he took off overseas and did locums in Australia and the UK, and then spent 14 years, I think, Dan, in Tyneside in Newcastle in the UK, and worked in the acute stroke unit there, which later became a hyperacute stroke unit. And as I said, he's part of the stroke rehab team based in Dunedin. Outside of work and family, he likes to pull on a wetsuit and go swimming in Targa Harbour, and open water swimming, or in the lakes of Central Otago. Sounds a bit chilly to me, but each to his own. So without further ado, Dan, I'll hand over to you. You're going to talk on gait and gait re-education, gait rehabilitation, and hopefully we'll learn some physiology as well as some practical tips. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks to everyone who's joined us so far this afternoon. I have to say that it's been a slightly eventful lead up to today, so hopefully everything runs smoothly. Things such as losing our ward because it's become a COVID overflow and all that sort of thing. But anyway, so what I'm going to talk about today is the neurophysiology behind how we produce normal gait. So if I could have the screen. So we're going to think about neurophysiology as the why of gait re-education. It's going to be sort of a bit of a two-pronged attack. I'm aware that we've got a mixed audience. We're going to have some physios in the audience and we're going to have non-physios. But so there's a little bit of something for both groups in that. I'm keen that everyone sort of leaving at the end today can go away with a few key messages for how anyone that's working with someone in gait re-education or in stroke care can contribute to the gait re-education of anyone that they're looking after. So the question is, why do we need to understand gait? Walking is often one of the most important goals of patients with neurological conditions. Obviously, in this case, we're talking about stroke. Anyone participating in rehab, usually the first thing that they'll say that they want to do is to get back on their feet, because they see that as the gateway to getting home. People well, they don't have to be, but the majority of people need to be mobile in some fashion to get home. That tends to be what they want to do. But how do we get from the man on the left here, we've all seen patients like this, to the man on the right, who clearly is obviously someone who's been through my stroke re-education program and has an excellent outcome. I didn't get these pictures off Google Images at all. So how do we know what to do? Should we go to the guidelines, find out what they say? So I had a look at the guidelines. Guidelines tend to be a bit vague, if I'm honest, when it comes to the specifics of what we're going to do. So it recommends that stroke survivors with any difficulty walking, so that could be anyone from a man in bed to someone who's just a little bit off balance, should be given the opportunity to undertake tailored repetitive practice of walking or the components of walking as much as possible. Great, sounds good. It's supporting what we do. But what is it that we do? Okay, and also they suggest that circuit classes are suitable, but they don't tell us what sort of exercises we should be doing in the circuit class. Treadmill training, okay, that seems fairly obvious. We're on a treadmill, we're getting to do the repetition of gait that we can't do in short corridors or in gym spaces. You can go for longer without having to change direction, etc., etc. You can add in body weight support or partial body weight support if that's necessary to make the patients feel safe or to unload legs. So that's probably the most specific thing I've been able to find. There's a few weak recommendations in the guidelines as well. So we've got virtual reality. I don't know how many people in publicly funded health systems have access to virtual reality kits. We do not in Southern DHB. We can barely string together a computer that can run this webinar. Electromechanically assisted gait training. So we're talking about your robotic stuff, the big clamp-on suits that actually physically help you with that. So we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars worth of kit. Again, in New Zealand, in a publicly funded system, chances of getting that kind of kit are pretty small. Biofeedback, okay, potentially useful for a small group of patients. Cueing of cadence, something we tend to associate a little bit more with your Parkinson's type patients, but obviously we can get Parkinsonian type symptoms post-stroke, so that's potentially useful. And finally, electrical stimulation. So we're talking about muscular electrical stimulation. Now, what you'll notice with most of these recommendations is that they're for a piece of kit. And that tends to be the problem with the body of evidence that we have for therapy for stroke rehabilitation at the moment, is that there's not a lot of breakdown of what it is we do as standard care to give us evidence of what bits of that standard care work and what don't. So we get comparison of something new, i.e. a piece of kit coming onto the market with what standard care is. And also, if you've got a piece of kit, the research behind that piece of kit is probably going to be funded by the maker of the piece of kit. Finding funding for research is often very, very difficult. So we haven't got a lot of detail about how we're actually going to rehabilitate someone's gait. So coming back to the question, why understand gait? If we understand the basics of how we walk normally, hopefully we'll have an understanding of which bits we can attack to try and re-educate the gait of our patients with an abnormal gait, someone that's been affected by stroke or any other conditions. Right, I'm going to stop sharing now and you get to see me. Apologies about that. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. So I'm just going to talk through the basic components of gait. So again, I'm not away from my face, which has got to be a good thing. Onto my legs. Now, there's two basic phases of the gait cycle. There's the stance phase, where we stand for the leg that we're standing on, and the swing phase when we're swinging it through. So I'm going to start at heel strike. So we're looking at my left leg. So the start of the stance phase is heel strike, and then we move into a loading phase where your foot is slowly lowered onto the floor, and your knee just bends slightly, so your quads act as a shock absorber for the weight coming onto that stance leg. Then as we come over the foot, we move into mid stance, so your knee by that stage is pretty much straight. And we're moving further through and into what we call terminal stance. Now, this is one of the key phases that I'm going to bang on about quite a lot today. So at this stage, we've still got an extended knee, or a hyperextended knee in my case. We've got hip extension, and we've got quite a significant degree of dorsiflexion. Moving into the next phase, we're going to heel off. So we're starting to unlock the knee, your heel's coming up, and then toe off after that. The toe off is quite crucial because a strong toe off is a lot of the driver for the swing phase of gait. The other thing that happens is that once we're in hip extension, our hip flexors, which are a big, thick muscle group, they're on quite a bit of stretch. So the elastic recoil of those hip extensors from that stretched position combined with the toe off means that most of swing phase is passive, as in we don't need to actively use muscles to do the bulk of that swing phase. So if we get those two components, most of the rest of it happens automatically. What we do need as we move into swings, we need a little bit of active knee flexion, so our hamstrings are going to switch on, and we need your toe to pick up so that foot can swing through. You do not clear your foot by very much over the through as you come through. There's probably only a couple of centimeters clearance. And we've probably done the thing where you're walking along a completely flat piece of floor and somehow you managed to catch and everyone's looking at you like you maybe had a beer at lunchtime or something. So yeah, there's that little clearance normally. So we don't provide ourselves with a lot of leeway. And then coming through into terminal swing, your quads switch on to get you into that extended position. Your pelvis rotates forward a little bit to lengthen the stride, and then we're back into heel strike. So that is the basic mechanics of the walking pattern. Okay, so what do we need? What is required to be able for us to be able to produce this gait pattern? So we need initiation. We need to get things underway. It needs to be efficient. We need to be able to be up on our feet for long periods of the day. And even older people, if they're still living at home, are going to spend fairly significant periods of time up and about on their feet. So it needs to be as efficient as possible, so that we can do it for as long as possible. It needs to be adaptable. We need to be able to alter our gait to the demands of both the task, what we're doing, and also to the environment. So, am I in a hurry to go and pick up my daughter from ballet, walking very fast and purposefully? Am I walking, meandering down a supermarket aisle, looking at what I need to be getting? Is the surface that I'm walking on uneven? Am I stepping up and down curbs? Is there a crowd of students walking towards me on their phones on TikTok constantly and paying no attention to who's coming towards them? So we need to be able to adapt to what's going on around us, as well as what we're actually trying to achieve by walking from A to B. And finally, we need automaticity. Now, when I did this presentation to my wife last night, she said, "Is that a real word?" I don't know, it is now. So basically, we need to be able to put walking on autopilot so that we can do something else at the same time. So I'm talking dual tasking. Yes, boys, we can do this, okay? We need to be able to walk and TikTok at the same time. I used to be able to talk about being able to walk and chew gum, comparing to George W. Bush, but no one remembers who George W. Bush is anymore, and everyone's all on their phones all the time. Okay. All right, so the systems that we're going to use to be able to do that, laid out on the slide. So we've got initiation from cortical, both cortical and subcortical structures, which gets the central pattern generator underway. Don't panic, I'm going to talk about what central pattern generators are pretty quickly. Once the central pattern generator gets us underway with walking, we're going to start to get sensory feedback. So that feeds back into the central pattern generator, but is also modulated by the central pattern. The sensory feedback feeds then into the cortex and also into subcortical structures, and we're then going to get modulation of the central pattern generator activity from those structures. Right, so how do we get underway? There are three main areas that we can use to fire up the reticulospinal system, which is the bit that initiates gait. There's the lateral hypothalamus, which requires a cortical drive. So this is our purposeful task-related sort of initiation. So it's me yesterday in a hurry going up the hill to go and get my daughter from ballet. It is, I'm walking to something to do something. There's the zona inserta, which is quite closely linked to visual input. You'll often hear this as a tourist walk, so it's a bit more meandering. It might be what we're using as we wander up and down the supermarket aisle, wondering why we can't get brown sugar for the 8th week running at the moment. And then there's the periventricular zone, which is our runaway zone. So of these three areas, there's two of them that we can potentially tap into to help patients to get up and going and get their gait initiated, which are the lateral hypothalamus and the zona inserta. We don't tend to scare the bejesus out of the patients and try and get them to run away. It's not particularly ethical. So yeah, we can use the visual and the task-related components of that to aid in the initiation of gait for the patients. So the instruction would be look up to something and walk to the target. So get the patient's wife on the far side of the gym, look up, walk to Mildred over there. I'm just going to stop sharing there now for a second. So once one of those three areas has got the reticulospinal system underway, zoom out a bit again. What the reticulospinal system will do is it builds up postural extension over the stance leg. Okay, so our trunk and our hip should be coming into more extension, and it shifts your weight onto the stance leg and away from what's going to become the swing leg. Now, as you shift your weight, your vestibular apparatus in your inner ear senses that shift of weight towards the outside of your base of support. So you sort of the edges of your cone of stability, and it thinks, oh, I'm moving to a position where I might fall. So its natural response to that is actually to strengthen the stance phase on that side to limit the chances of you falling over that leg. So it's actually quite clever to use that sort of automatic function of the vestibular spinal system to strengthen the stance phase as we come onto that leg. But what it does mean is that from a therapeutic point of view, it's if someone's got a weak leg, if we can get them to transfer their weight onto it, we can tap into that vestibular spinal activity, that automatic activity, because your vestibular spinal system is subcortical, so the majority of strokes are not going to have affected it. To help to strengthen that stance phase. Now, it is a position where patients are going to feel unsteady and unsafe. So we need to make them feel safe to be there, and we need to build them enough strength and stability to be there safely, to be able to use that automatic strengthening of stance. All right, we just need to skip on a couple. Here again. Right, central pattern generators. What are they? So the central pattern generators have been identified in quite a number of different animals. They're spinal circuits that can, in the absence of any descending input, so from the cortex or in the subcortical areas, it can produce a rhythmical activity. So we've got central pattern generators for breathing. Don't need to think about breathing, it just happens. We've got them for chewing. We don't have them for swimming. Even Erica Fairweather doesn't have a swimming central pattern generator. This is a lot of the research into central pattern generators has been done on lamprey eels because they have a very simple movement pattern. Basically, flex one side, extend the other side, and then the reverse. The one that we're interested in is a gait central pattern generator. So it's thought to be housed in around about the L3 area of the spinal cord. And we'll talk about the structure of it in a second. So once we get underway, once we've initiated gait, the central pattern generator takes over, and it will just carry things on as long as it's getting the right sensory input until any adaptation is required. So this is your basic structure of a central pattern generator, okay? So there's one for each leg. So we have a flexor half center, which probably needless to say works on your swing phase, and an extensor half center, which works on your stance phase. Now, we have a reciprocal inhibition circuit between the two of them. So what that means is that one can't be functioning while the other is, because what we don't want is you transfer your weight onto a stance leg and suddenly your flexor half center kicks in and starts to bend your knee. You'll fall over at that stage. So while you're in stance, the activity that will produce a swing is being inhibited. As we come towards the end of the stance, there's a timing function which will allow that to gradually turn off, and the flexor half center, your swing phase center, takes over. We have descending cortical modulation of this. So all of your descending modulation of your gait runs through the central pattern generators, but it's independent of those. The central pattern generator can function independently of that. What I don't have in this particular diagram is the fact that both sides receive sensory feedback, which helps to strengthen what's going on. So what is the role of that somatosensory input, that sensory feedback that they're getting? So that reinforces the central pattern generator activity, especially in the load-bearing muscles. Okay, so in isolation, your central pattern generator can continue to produce the gait pattern as long as it's getting the sensory feedback to keep it going. The interesting thing here is that your Golgi tendon organ which senses tension in a muscle and would normally limit the development of tension to protect against injury, as that information is fed through the central pattern generator, it actually strengthens stance. So it flips it around and it helps to increase the amount of tension to make a stronger stance phase. So again, we need to get the weight on that leg to increase the tension so that it's reinforcing that activity of the central pattern generator to build us a nice strong stance. Similarly, your muscle spindle, which senses alteration in length of a muscle, normally it will limit the change in length of a muscle through your stretch reflex, which I think most people have at least heard of. That input is inhibited once it's run through the central pattern generator to allow us to move over that foot to get into that terminal stance phase. It allows your calf to lengthen until late stance, and then it flips that around and it actually enhances the stretch reflex to allow a strong toe off. Again, it's something we don't need to think about. We're using the basic underlying physiology of muscles and just modulating it to make it more effective. The other thing the sensory information does is it helps to facilitate phase transitions. So the beginning of stance I talked about before when you could see my legs, sorry about that, is that heel strike. So we've got some pressure receptors in the heel, so an area about the size of your thumbnail, which is just on the point of your heel. If we get a nice heel strike at the start of stance, that feeds into that extensor half center and just helps to set up a good, strong stance. Similarly, at the end of stance, start of swing, the stretch of the hip flexors. So we talked about that being, we've got the passive recoil of those hip flexors, but also the length of those hip flexors. That information is fed into the central pattern generator, and that will stimulate the beginning of swing phase. As well as that, there's the unloading of the extensor muscles as the weight comes off it. So it senses that loss of tension, and that will feed into the flexor half center to allow a nice, strong, automatic central pattern generator swing. The key things there for us, if we can get the patient to heel strike, and this applies to anyone, outside of stroke rehab, there's a lot of groups of patients that don't get a particularly good heel strike. If we can get that heel strike, it really helps to prepare a nice, strong stance. And if we can get patients into genuine terminal stance, we're probably going to get that nice automatic central pattern generator swing. All right, so what is the descending modulation on the central pattern generator? You've heard me talking about the reticulospinal system and its involvement in the initiation of central pattern generator activity. And then after that, it's got an ongoing feed-forward preparatory control. So your reticulospinal system is the system that does your planned movement. It is what gives us nice, smooth, controlled movement. It acts just slightly ahead of when we actually produce the movement, and it's key in terms of posture and balance. The vestibular spinal system is your rapid response system for unplanned events. So it's the system that's going to get you back in balance when you're standing on the train and it suddenly starts moving you weren't expecting it. It's very fast acting, and it is as fast acting as it is because it has a limited number of motor options in terms of how it's going to respond to different perturbations of your balance. So it's quite limited, but it's very fast. So it deals with the unexpected. Finally, we've got your corticospinal system. We often think about the corticospinal system in relation to hands. It's what does your distal fine function of the hand. But in terms of walking, in terms of gait, your corticospinal system is what acts predominantly on swing, and particularly complex swing. So it's what does the adaptation to environmental challenges. So if we have to step over a tree root or round a cat or change direction suddenly because someone's walking towards us on TikTok, then this is what's going to help us to do that. The cerebellum. I love the cerebellum. It's a great bit of kit. It's been around for years. It's got two main functions in terms of gait. Firstly, it's the clock. It backs up the central pattern generator timing, and it's very heavily involved in the timing of phase change and phase linked activities. So obviously, when we're talking about gait, we've got a stance phase and a swing phase. It helps to time the change from stance to swing. It's backing up what the central pattern generator is doing. Similarly, anything else where we're moving from one phase to another, it is what helps us with the timing of that. But more importantly, it monitors what's going on in terms of our walking. It's what makes sure that what we want to happen is what actually. Okay, so it's got a copy of the plan coming down from the cortex. We're trying to get ourselves from A to B, so it knows roughly what we're going to be trying to do. It receives proprioceptive and tactile information from all over the body, particularly the lower limbs when we're talking about gait, but everything. It gets a copy of what's going on in the central pattern generator as well. So that increases the knowledge of what's supposed to be going on. And it takes visual and vestibular input and builds that into the monitoring. So within the cerebellum, there's a little area called the olive, and the olive is involved in monitoring the sensory input and motor output for any unexpected events. So it's looking for things that we weren't expecting to happen. If it senses something that wasn't supposed to happen, then it disinhibits the cerebellar nuclei and allows them to respond to those events and modify the motor system. So those nuclei then act on the descending tracks, the three that I mentioned before, to modify the motor output and adjust for any unexpected events. So your cerebellum is basically what makes sure that what you want to happen happens, and it happens nice and smoothly and in a controlled fashion. So we're going to flip back to me again. Terminal stance is key. I'm going to show you my legs again. Some would say they're my best part. I'm not 100% certain. All right, so we need to get patients into this position. However, because for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, so we're getting that elastic recoil of the hip flexors, we're getting a nice strong toe off, we're getting that somatosensory feedback from those hip flexors and the unloading of the leg from that position to reinforce that central pattern generator activity. The difficulty we have is that position, or just prior to heel strike on the other side, you are actually technically falling. So you may have heard gait described as a series of controlled falls. This is the bit where we're falling. So if we've got a group of patients that feel unsteady and unsafe on their feet, quite possibly they're older and may have had some falls in the past, then getting them into that position where they're falling, getting them to commit to that position can be quite challenging. So we need to find ways to support the patient to get into that terminal stance phase. Okay. To help the patients to be able to do that, we need to build up enough postural stability over that stance leg to give the patients the confidence to get there. So we need a good solid trunk. So we might work on the trunk in lying and side lying. We might do some bridging. We might work in sitting. We need to build up the extension of the trunk over that side that's going to become a stance side. Similarly, we need some stability around the hip and pelvis. Okay, so again, I mentioned bridging. We do a lot of hip and pelvic exercises in isolation, and then we get people up and put them into a position where that is going to be utilized. Don't forget that heel strike, because if we can get a heel strike, that's going to strengthen that stance phase and make the patient feel much, much more confident to be out there. The patients have to have a leg to stand on. All right, key message don't think too much about your walking. This may seem strange message in the middle of a 45-minute long discussion about how we're walking, but the gait pattern that's produced by a central pattern generator or central pattern generators is a much more fluid and efficient pattern than anything we can provide by thinking about it. So the message is, if you think about how you're walking, you're probably going to screw it up. I say this to patients all the time. So we as therapists need to work on the components that we're going to put into the gait pattern. But once the patient's actually up on their feet, we need them to think about where they're going and how fast they want to get there. And is there anything complicated in the way, rather than how am I actually going to walk? Physios, we need to shut up, stop giving instructions during gait training. Okay, there was an observational study done at the University of Southampton in about 2012, 2013, where they watched a group of physios doing gait re-education with patients, and the average number of instructions per half-hour session, 64 instructions to patients that quite possibly have a degree of language impairment or maybe a wee hint of delirium or dementia going on. It's no good giving them that many instructions. Get them up, get them going. Don't instruct them as they're going. Walk to target. So this is key in terms of aiding the initiation of gait. So get the patient to look up to the target and get them to walk towards it. Once they look up, it improves that postural extension that we need for the initiation of gait, and we also need for the maintenance of gait. And it also gives us access to that lateral hypothalamus and zone inserter pathways for the initiation. Build up the complexity of walking. So as people are getting better on their feet, nobody really has the opportunity to walk in straight lines on flat ground all the time. Okay, most houses, you can't walk for more than 2 or 3 meters within somebody's house without them having to go around something, change direction. Similarly, if we're out and about in the community, there's not that often that you're going to have straight flat ground with nobody around. So we need to increase the complexity of excuse me, complexity of the terrain and the environment to train the adaptability of the gait. We need to take patients into complicated environments. Take them down into the lobby past the coffee shop where no one's paying any attention to anyone around them. All they're focused on is when someone's going to hand them a flat white. Get them to walk through there. We need them to be able to utilize the functions that are going to allow them to deal with unexpected stimuli. So that's your vestibular-spinal functions and that's your cerebellar functions. So what might interfere with this perfect world of gait re-education? The pusher syndrome, or any marked overactivity on the unaffected side. Associated reaction and increased tone, they're probably going to impact. We'll talk about that in a second. Foot drop is quite a common one that requires an exaggerated swing phase. Any pre-morbid limitations or fear of falling. And quite a biggie that's often overlooked is any altered sensation or inattention to the affected side. The other thing that might interfere with a normal gait pattern is gait aids. We'll come on to that at the end. Right, so if I can borrow my glamorous assistant, Pam. So Pam has not, in fact, had a stroke, which is quite fortuitous, and she's our associate charge nurse. But she is, so for those of you that haven't seen the pusher syndrome, patients will push themselves away from their good side, their unaffected side, towards their weak side, and they'll resist any attempt to bring them passively back to the midline, okay? So this is caused by an alteration in their body schema, which means that their perception of where their midline is in relation to gravity is shifted over towards the weak side. So Pam feels like she's sitting in the middle here. If I come along and pull her back, she feels like I'm tipping her over she's going to fall towards her good side. So whenever we see in sitting, we're going to tend to see worse than standing. So I'm going to stand Pam up, get it up here, and she's going to be leaning away from me, and I'm pulling it back. What you'll see, I've seen a number of pictures on the internet of people trying to deal with people that are pushing, and they're coming in on the left-hand side here and trying to push the patient back into the middle. Golden rule, never push a pusher, okay? All they're going to feel like you're doing is pushing them over towards their affected side. So what we want to do is try to make them feel safe to come onto the leg that they're pushing away from. So Pam, you're going to bring your hip to my leg, and you're going to bring your shoulder to my leg. Giving someone support of the hand can sometimes be problematic as well, because if you give a pusher support through their hand, they'll often just want to push away from it. So I might get Pam to put her arm around my shoulder. My shoulder is reasonably high for Pam, but the advantage of that is that it helps to build up extension on the affected side of the trunk, and we can then easily bring her onto that leg. Okay. Thank you, Pam. That was sensational. So it doesn't really matter whether the patients are, by strict definitions, a pusher, or whether they're just significantly overactive, because realistically, the behaviours that we see are the same. We struggle to get patients up onto the unaffected leg, and at the same time that that's happening, if we've got that overactivity going on in one leg, it's going to inhibit the activity of the weak leg. So not only are they not standing on their supposed good leg, but the weak leg is being inhibited. So these patients literally don't have a leg to stand on. So we've got to get that midline sorted. We've got to get them settled into genuine stance on the unaffected side first, because that's going to allow us, once they settle into that position, that's going to allow us to access any activity that we've got in the affected leg. Then we need to get them up onto into a genuine stance on the affected leg. So it may seem a little bit round the wrong way to be concentrating on the unaffected side initially, and patients often struggle to grasp that. They can't understand, well, this is my good side, why are you worrying about that? The key is we've got to get them up onto that, get that settled, that overactivity, that push settled down before we can access what's going on in the affected leg. Then we build the activity. Doesn't mean to say that you don't want to be working on building up of that postural extension. It may be slightly less challenging postures. So work on it in sitting, work on it in sideline, work on it in supine. We don't necessarily need to be exposing them to that for you. All right. Sorry guys, we're having a minor technical issue here. We'll be back with you in a moment. So, okay, we're back.
Sorry.
Okay, so the next bit we're going to talk about is associated reaction and increased tone. So what I mean by associated reaction is those early increases in tone that we see after stroke. So we might see the arm starting to come up into that normal high tone pattern of elbow flexion, pronation, adduction of the shoulder, retraction of the scapula. We might see there's two different sort of associated reactions we might get in the leg. We might get a sort of a positive supporting reaction, an increasing extension, or we might get a flexion withdrawal type of reaction. All of those reactions that we're seeing are vestibulospinal activity that's unchecked because we haven't got the postural stability to be able to do it in a controlled fashion. So your vestibulospinal system is sensing, I'm off balance here, I'm unstable. So it's kicking in with anything it can do to try and make the patient feel stable, make the patient stable, because that's what the vestibulospinal system is all about. So if we're seeing those patterns of movement coming in, they're not going to make the patient more stable in this situation. So we need to try and replace that with something else. So what we need to then do is maybe back off some of the activities that are making the patient feel unstable. So it might be standing, it might be stepping, it might be interwalking, and build a bit more stability and less challenging posture. So what we're trying to do is replace that vestibulospinal, that automatic uncontrolled sort of reaction, with a planned reticulospinal system activity. Okay, so we're replacing postural control, postural instability with postural control. So if you get people up, get them walking, and we're starting to get that stuff coming in, sometimes we need to back off a bit and just build up that stability a bit more before we can take them there. Right, AFOs. AFOs improve gait pattern. Sarah Tyson made it quite clear in her 2013 meta-analysis of this. The advantages for us are that there's less cortical drive required. Okay, so it's really just supporting. So for those of you that aren't familiar with AFOs, an ankle foot orthosis goes into the shoe. It helps to hold your toe up as you're swinging your foot through. It means that we don't have to think about picking that foot up. So we're not interfering with the central back generation activity. It's more automatic, it's faster. So the evidence is quite clear on that. People walk faster and they walk with a more normal gait pattern with AFOs on. I would say in the early phases, go with a lightweight one here. We've got the image there, I've just realized isn't particularly obvious. It is a lightweight AFO. Because if we've got a little bit of spring involved in it, then we can utilize some of the toe off. If we have a rigid AFO, then it's going to limit the toe off that the patient's able to achieve. If we're starting to get some associated reactions that are producing maybe some inversion of the ankle, then we might need to go for a bit of lateral stability. If we're into the situation where someone's got some significant increased tone, then there's a good chance we're going to need to go for a hinged fitted AFO or one of the carbon fiber ones, the expensive ones. All right, big one, premorbid function and fear of falling. So as stroke is primarily a disease of older people, not exclusively obviously, but the bulk of our patients with stroke are older. Most of them will have some pre-existing medical conditions. So not all of those conditions are going to impact on what we want to do with people. But if people have got arthritis, if they've got long-standing back pain, if they've got a bit of ankylosing spondylitis, if they've started to fall, and this is a big one, if they've had falls prior to having a stroke, then that pre-existing fear of falling will be amplified significantly once they have a stroke and everything is more difficult. And that can be really difficult to overcome, that fear of falling. It might be where we need to potentially involve psychologists if we've got access to them. But from a therapeutic point of view, it's all about making the patients feel safe to be as close to a normal pattern as possible. There are a number of people, if you've been walking like the guy in the picture for 20 years, we're not going to get you standing up straight and getting into terminal stance phase. So we're just going to have to park that ideal and we're going to have to adapt and find ways to get them on their feet other ways. So sensory loss and inattention is quite a biggie. As scary as being in that stance phase can be, imagine doing it when you can't feel where your leg is in space. Okay, so if we've got a significant sensory loss, or we've got maybe intact sensation but some inattention, then your brain is not registering in useful time where that leg is in space. That doesn't mean that there's not sensory information being sent up there, and there are areas of the cortex that will be dealing with it and dealing appropriately with it. But from a perceptual point of view, it's quite scary to take all your weight onto a leg you can't feel. In terms of rehabilitating this, what we need to do is we need to throw as much sensory feedback at the cortex as we possibly can to try and stimulate that neuroplastic response, get another area of the brain to take over the job of processing that information. Because the information is coming, it just needs processing and putting into meaningful experience for the patient. So if we're thinking about how we go about sensory re-education, your proprioception is made up of about 60% muscle spindle and 30% Golgi tendon organ input. So that's coming back to that, we're talking about length, change in length of the muscle from muscle spindle and development of tension within the muscle from the Golgi tendon organ. So utilizing that, about 90% of our proprioception is related to having weight and movement of muscle. So that means that if we can get patients into weight bearing or closed chain sort of activities, it's going to give us the most sensory feedback. It's going to give us the most bang for our buck. So doing open chain quads exercises is not going to be as effective as doing a step up or working on stance with support, because we're not going to get as much sensory feedback. Right. Okay, so the impact of using gait aids. I'll just move this thing down a bit. So I've got a frame set up here. It's just about tall enough for me. As soon as we give a patient a frame, the first thing that they do is they put some weight on it. And if you look at what's happened to my hips there, I've gone from being in a reasonable amount of extension, some would say hyperextension, is in a slightly swayed out posture, but I've gone into a little bit of hip flexion. Almost everybody does this when they use a frame. So if I walk, the chances of me getting into genuine hip extension, even there where I've taken the same size stride as I did before, I'm only in neutral. So effectively from the hip extension point of view, I'm in mid-stance there. I've got the stretch in the calf, but I'm lacking the stretch in the hip flexor, which is one of those key inputs for swing phase. And also provides us with that passive impetus, that momentum for swing. So for me then to swing that leg through, it's much more a cortically driven activity and it's much harder work. Similarly, particularly if you're a bloke with slightly short hamstrings, like I know a lot of blokes are, me included, if you're slightly flexed forward already, trying to get the heel strike becomes much harder. I can feel my hamstring stretched there already. Nicole's looking at me with horror because she's dancing rather more flexible than I am. But it makes getting that heel strike less likely. So we're losing your passive impetus for swing, and we're decreasing the chances of getting that nice, strong stance phase through getting a good heel strike. Similarly, if we give the patients a stick, the reason you would give someone a stick is to just redistribute the weight from a weak or painful leg away from it, to take some of the weight through the arm. So the whole idea of it is to take weight away from the affected leg. But we know from what I've been talking about for the last little while that we need to get weight onto that leg to utilize that vestibular-spinal support, that automatic subcortical support for the strength of that stance phase. We need to get the weight transfer over there. If we use a stick, we're not going to get that. If we use a quad stick, the patients are going to lean even more weight on it, and that's going to further enhance that lack of weight distribution onto the leg. All right, nearly made it, people. Nearly made it. So I've got 6 take-home messages for you. If you remember nothing else from this session other than these 6 messages, and you can put them into practice with patients, then I can sleep easy at night. Okay, first, look up and walk to a target. Don't think about how you're going to walk, just think about where you're going to. Second, encourage heel strike to set up a strong stance. We can use this with a whole bunch of patients outside of the stroke realm as well. Really, really useful. Parkinson's patients, patients with a bit of arthritis, patients with pain. They often don't like to heel strike, but if they do, they get a much stronger leg, and that extra muscle activity will actually decrease the pain rather than increasing it. We need a strong weight-bearing terminal stance as a key for accessing that efficient swing phase. So we get into that terminal stance phase, we get a nice, smooth, easy swing. If we need to retrain sensation or the perception of sensation, then weight-bearing activity is our best bet. It gives us the best bang for our buck. We need to train complex gait. We need to look for some rough terrain. We need to look for busy environments. Finally, think about what you're doing before you give someone a gait aid. It may be unavoidable. As I say, we've got a lot of patients that might have been using them before, or we're not ever going to find a way to get them over that fear of falling. We just need to make them safe. If we think that this is a patient that is potentially going to make a good recovery, and by good, I mean, getting back to walking without, if we give them a gait aid and we send them home with it, the chances of them getting off that aid once they get home drop dramatically. Okay, so just think about what impact that is going to have in terms of down the track. It might make them safe now and might limit the amount of improvement that they can get further down the track. We all work in underfunded public health services that are under pressure to shift people through all the time. So the message is get people safe any way you can and get them out the door. But just think about it. Just think where we're going by the end of it. And that's me. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dan. Have you unshared your screen?
We have.
Great. Okay. So, very informative talk, Dan. I see we've got one, just a comment in there on the Q&A. Can I start the questions, Dan? The central pattern generator, obviously very important. Just to use an analogy, say with Parkinson's, that it seems that cycling seems to help people with Parkinson's, and I wonder whether it's through that mechanism. Is it generalizable to get, say, stroke patients who can't weight bear so well to cycle that might help that process? In terms for generalizing it to walking?
I don't know that, because we haven't got, with cycling, you haven't got the sort of the key sensory components coming in that's going to fire up that central pattern generator activity. However, cycling as a way of strengthening a potential stance leg, or a leg that we're going to put into gait, I don't think it's going to actually have an impact on accessing the central pattern generator as such, but it's going to strengthen up aspects of the leg that we're going to need the patient to stand on. So it's certainly not going to do any harm. All right.
There's no questions in the Q&A at the moment, but if you've got questions for Dan, then feel free to type them in there. I can ask another chairman's prerogative question, Dan, in terms of you talked about neurophysiology being the reason why. I'm going to challenge that a wee bit and say, from the patient's point of view, the reason why is actually to do other things. It's not to walk. The walking is just the means, and it's not the end itself. The patients seem to think in hospital that it's the end goal, but in fact, it's just an intermediary goal. It's really, what can I do? Can I walk to the coffee shop? Can I walk to the gardens with my grandchildren or whatever? So how do we prepare them for that? Because I think our hospitals are quite, as you've mentioned, quite flat. They're sterile. We need to get them walking far enough and have enough endurance and be able to do rough surfaces and things as well as have sufficient practice. How do we build that in?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's really difficult when you've got patients in a hospital setting for a number of reasons. One, you're right, they're focused on, they're thinking about if I can get up and walk, then I can get around the house, then I can go home. So, they lose track of that bigger picture, and there's so much drive within, the stretch services that we have to get people out that we think about the critical criteria for discharge. We come back again and again to, can they walk? Can they get in and out of bed? Can they toilet themselves? It's all very basic day-to-day stuff, and there's not much why am I doing this in terms of what quality of life am I going to have actually once I get out of hospital. So I think that's where the goal setting process comes in really key, is getting patients not just to think about what do I need to achieve to be able to get home, but once I get home, what do I want to do? What is my life going to be? What do I want to be able to do? Do I want to be able to run around with my grandkids? Do I want to be able to walk down to the cafe to meet friends? Do I want to be able to do Tai Chi in the park? And as you say, walking is often the how of how they're going to be able to access those things. So I think having those conversations much earlier in the inpatient stay than we probably tend to is something that certainly I know we should be doing better in Southern. And I suspect it probably goes around most sort of inpatient stroke rehab sort of units. Start to think about what the end goal is. Where do I want to be in 6 months' time? What do I want to be able to do? It's also as well a little bit about giving the patients a bit of a perception of what might be possible, because people come in, they've had a stroke, it's this horrific, disabling thing, they can't do anything, they're dependent on staff to do everything for them, they can't see a future. And so we have to sort of, without guiding them to what they want to do, we have to paint a picture of what might be feasible, because riding a unicycle after a right MCA stroke is probably not going to be practical, but there's a lot of things, if we make a good recovery after that stroke, that they may be able to do, but they might not be able to see that at the time. So it's giving them a realistic expectation of what might be possible, so that they can look beyond just the walls of getting past the door of the hospital.
Okay, there's a couple of related questions here, both about gait aids or walking aids. One is about how do you advocate for patients to stay longer if you're aiming to get them walking without an aid. And
it's always a bit of a negotiation. And sometimes it is thinking about, painting a picture to the interdisciplinary team about, this patient was pretty active before, they've made a really good recovery, they've got the potential to be good. If we give them this aid now, that's potentially going to put a cap on that. And setting that it maybe as a goal early in the goal setting process. Want this patient to be off a walking frame or off a stick before they go home, because as I say, if they go home with it, chances are that's going to be them for the remainder of their life. There are those obviously patients out there that are very motivated and they want, they'll do anything to get as good as they can. The majority of patients, they will go home and they will find the easiest way. And if the easy way, the safe way is with an aid, that's potentially going to have long-term consequences.
Yeah. The alternative view that sometimes I subscribe to as well is a gait aid early on may give the person independence in the ward and allow greater repetition of walking. And providing we've got mechanisms, and I think certainly our community stroke team here in Christchurch does get people off their walking aid later on. And so I don't think it's inevitable they stay on that. But one of the opposite points of view, and I agree with you in terms of from purist gait re-education, a walking aid isn't good. But if it achieves the end of getting them independent and allowing high repetitions and getting them home where they can do more and then working on that, that might be an alternative as long as we've got that safety net.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's actually one group of stroke patients that I routinely do use a walking frame with, and that's the ataxic patients. I'm very careful when I give an ataxic patient a frame in the early stages that I sell it to them as this is a bridge to get you walking without it. So in a few days' time, I'm going to come back and I'm going to take this frame off you. Because you're not going to need it. So if you set that expectation early, that can work really well. I totally agree that fostering independence, particularly with patients on the ward, because we tend to wrap people up and bubble wrap because of the safety culture within hospitals. I'm not saying we shouldn't be safe, but that fear of falls within a hospital environment is very, very real. And there's investigations into every fall that happens in an inpatient environment. So giving someone an aid that allows them to be up and on their feet safely, so that staff they're not reliant on staff. It's going to have a massive impact from a psychological point of view because we're regaining some independence. Someone who's maybe been dependent on staff for 2, 3, 4 weeks, suddenly they're up and they can be doing something by themselves, and they're doing it safely. And if they can do it by themselves, then they can get much more repetition. You're absolutely right. Repetition is the key in rehab. So if we can get more reps in and sell them that idea that we're hoping that they're going to progress off it, then that's going to be beneficial. One of the tricks you can do with particularly using sticks is to make the stick very high so that it's harder for the patient to transfer sort of their weight over onto it. So it becomes more a balance aid rather than an actual redistribution of weight away from the affected leg that we're trying to get them onto. So put the stick high or use poles. We used to have a couple of 3 metre long bamboo poles that a patient's wife brought into us years ago, which we put a ferrule on the bottom of. They were great. They were light, they were strong, they were rigid. Unfortunately, infection control saw them and had a small hissy fit and we had to throw them out. That sort of thing can sort of minimise the impact on the pattern of gait, but allow that independence and that ability to be up and getting loads and loads of reps. Reps are key.
All right. Another question here is about not giving instructions and telling your physios to shut up during gait retraining. But the question is, do you give instructions before and after training? And is it a good idea to provide tactile instruction and timing and frequency of giving instructions during training?
So yes, I would usually, like if I'm going to take a patient for a walk, I'll usually pick out a couple of components of the gait pattern that maybe we've been working on with some specific exercises leading up to that, and get them to focus on this is what we're going to try and achieve today. So we want to be a bit more upright, so keep looking up, and we're going to try and get you further onto that leg. Tactile, definitely. The chances are to make the patients feel safe, we're going to have hands on them. So we want to make that handling as useful as possible. So whether it's providing support to get that leg into terminal stance, so maintaining that knee extension to allow them to get into terminal stance, whether it's initiating the swing if we're not quite getting them there, whether it's a little bit of lateral support if they're ataxic. Handling is really important, and it's beyond the scope of what I can sort of try and teach in a webinar setting. If you want to learn that, you're going to need to actually work with somebody.
So you're giving instructions, you're trying to shut up during it, but you're probably giving them feedback before and after. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And try and get them to give feedback as well. So if get them to reflect on how did that feel, because how it feels is actually really important. So if they come back and say, oh, that felt easier, I felt like my leg was swinging through better, you can maybe then talk about why that might be. It might be we've got better weight transfer onto the stance leg, which is allowing the leg to swing through. It might be that we're getting further into that terminal stance, which is allowing more automatic swing. So using the patient's experience of it, because that's what's going to make it real for them.
Two related questions here about gaining walking aids. One is about impact of fatigue, particularly when they can't go home. And some patients do use them selectively. They'll only use a gait aid when they're feeling tired, and what you think of that. And as well as just being able to integrate into the community, because sometimes a gait aid, say a frame, allows them to walk further and faster and get them into the community. So I think it's one of those sort of participatory sort of goals versus the pragmatics of pure gait retraining. And then the other question was related to, are you suggesting that most patients, you get most patients walking without an aid after stroke? And I don't think you were saying that. I think you were being pragmatic, saying that we need
to say that we're that good here, but we're not. The majority of our patients will go home with some kind of aid. Not everybody does. But our unit here is a unit for older patients, so we're often dealing with those that have come in with some pre-existing issues as well. In terms of the fatigue side of things, absolutely. And thinking about it not only at home when they're starting to, when the demand on them goes up significantly, but also when we're just sort of transitioning people into mobilizing on the ward as well. So we might get someone that can walk in the morning and into the early afternoon unaided, but they might need to use a stick or a frame as they get tired. And this is one of the things that the allied health teams often sort of forget, is we see them at their best. We see them when they're, we've warmed up their system and everything's working as well as it could be. We don't see them at 2 o'clock in the morning when they're getting up in a bit of a hurry to try and get to the toilet before they pee themselves. That's when all bets are off, and we really have to listen to our nursing staff, what's happening overnight, what's happening in the evening, how are they functioning in that sort of situation, and do we need to provide them with a bit more support. In terms of getting out and accessing the community, yeah, I totally agree. If it's the difference between someone being able to get to somewhere and not, I'm not going to stop them just for purist, you're not walking quite right, we don't want to see you doing that. I want them out there doing stuff, participating, getting out of the house, being part of the community, being part of, being involved with their families, everything that gives them quality of life once they get out of hospital. It's not just about walking like a model after you've had your stroke. Okay,
that's probably a good note to end, Dan. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I do really appreciate it. And I over the last 24 hours, I've learnt some of the heartaches about the IT issues you've been having. So I appreciate the angst that's gone with this presentation. So thank you very much. It's been a very informative as well as practical presentation. So thank you. Thank you for the team and behind, for Jane and for the South Island Alliance and the Stroke Foundation, and just setting up this webinar. And thank you for everybody who's joined. That we will send you a email link or on the finish of the Zoom to give you a brief survey. Please fill that out. We are interested in what you think. And we look forward to hosting another webinar, hopefully in another couple of months. So watch this space. But thank you very much.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I feel a lot calmer now that I've done it. Yeah, the IT's worked relatively straightforward than I did about 3 hours ago, where I thought I was going to spontaneously combust. So thanks everyone for joining and for listening and asking some really good questions.
All right. Thank you.